Welcome back. I can also say a welcome back to our audience online. Thank you for joining us online. We're going to move to our second session in this PSI-sponsored merit event, where we're going to bring in the idea of integration. We've addressed it previously, but now in greater detail. It's my great privilege to introduce our two speakers for the next session, Dr. Sandra Monteiro and Renate Kahlke. Dr. Monteiro is a merit scientist with an appointment in the Department of Medicine here at McMaster. She's also the Director for Simulation Scholarship in the Center for Simulation-Based Learning at McMaster. Her research focuses on critically examining misinformation and inequity in medical education. And she has won a number of awards for her work as both a scientist, an educator, and a mentor, including the Meredith Marks New Educator Award, a K-Prime Fellowship, and the K-Mentor of the Year Award. Dr. Kahlke is also a scientist within merit with an appointment in the Department of Medicine. She has a program of research that uses sociocultural theories and qualitative and mixed methods to examine issues of well-being and equity in health professions, with particular attention to racism and anti-fat bias in medical education. In addition to receiving a number of awards from SSHRC and from McMaster in grant competitions, she's also acknowledged as a qualitative methodologist whose work is influencing the qualitative methodology field. I'll turn it over to them to discuss integration. Thank you both.
Thanks so much. Tim is a really tough act to follow. That was a really lovely talk. This is a bit more new for us, so not quite off book yet. But I'm also grateful to be following Tim because I think he very nicely set up some ideas about mixed methods for us. Specifically, where this talk is situated is Tim talked about mixing at the level of research question, at the level of design, at the level of methodology, at the level of results, and at the level of dissemination. We're going to take you back to the beginning because we've been thinking about how you create a mixed methods question and how you formulate a mixed methods problem. So how do you create that really complex picture of a problem that is best addressed through multiple or mixed methods? So we have like a couple of objectives for you. We're going to focus on this idea of integrative thinking. If you don't know what that is right now, that's great because we're going to tell you. We're going to describe how integrative thinking can be mobilized to frame and address complex problems in our field of health professions education, but also applicable to health research and maybe anywhere else you might work. We're going to give you 3 strategies that we pulled out from some of our work in other spaces about thinking through how to frame the literature, how to frame conversations in a way that addresses their complexity. And then last in the discussion, we're hoping you're going to think about integrative thinking and how it can frame a problem in your context. But to get you there, we wanted to first talk a little bit about us, how we came to mixed methods, and what our health professions education space looks like. So I'm Renate. I have a background in education. I use a lot of qualitative methods, and I like things like sociocultural theory or critical theories or those ways of seeing the world. Sandra has very different disciplinary training than me. She comes from cognitive psychology. She insists that I call things scales and not surveys. Didn't even know that was different before. And just has been trained in very different methods than me. And I think that's more common than abnormal in our field. So people are just coming from completely different spaces, using different training, thinking different things are important, and framing ideas in a different way. And that can and should be a strength in our field, right? But I think our experience is that we come here and we talk to each other at conferences, maybe have a beer, but we don't always integrate our thinking when it comes to problems. We still kind of work in little silos where people do their quantitative research and on assessment, and then they reference other quantitative papers on assessment. And I think about how people experience that thing, and I reference other papers that think about that and try to build on that. So when we came to mixed methods, Sandra started us off with a topic that I had no idea what she was talking about, but she said, why MMR? Like, what can mixed methods research do for us here, specifically in the concrete rather than the abstract? So we wanted to think through how mixed methods would help us frame these questions differently. How would it help us bring this like rich diversity and strength of our field together to solve some of the intractable problems that we were seeing? Places where we build on previous research that's like ours, but somehow the solutions always seem to get away, right? They just never quite make sense for what we're trying to do. And, yeah, pass me.
All right, I'm switching in. There we go. For some reason, whenever Renata introduces us and kind of goes, there's like some qual, there's some quant. For those of you of this generation, I always think she's a little bit country, I'm a little bit rock and roll. I don't know if you get that, but that's just, I'm like, just probably the best thing, but we kind of make music together. So here we are. So in terms of why, yeah, that's usually me. I'm the like, you know, the person you're like, why do you have to ask a question now? We were just wrapping up. We'd invited Cheryl Poth to actually lead us through learning about mixed methods research. And then the first, like, why? It's like, well, you brought me here. I don't know what you're asking of me. But I chose this image, to sort of represent what I was struggling with in that moment. And so, you know, the dominoes was sort of like this visual representation of quant stuff. And then you've got these typeset things, the letters of qual data. And I was working through, well, I know a lot of excellent qualitative researchers who've contributed greatly to our understanding of medical education, lots of phenomenon in health professions, research. And then similarly for the quant, like there's so many different scales to understand people's attitudes and emotions and all of that. And so if there's any one topic, and I personally have a lot, an extensive background in competency-based assessment of clinicians, so postgraduate assessment of clinical competence in various health professions, but for now I'll just say PGME to kind of refer to all of that. And I was thinking, well, I draw on both of these, and I kind of integrated in my head, right? So part of it was, well, why do we need to learn this methodology? What is the benefit of doing this as a team? And so sort of this question, why do we need to combine different forms of data when each tradition has its own strengths? And I don't know what recipe involves all of these things. Maybe it's a salad and a cabbage soup, but they each have their own strengths. We can do a literature review and find all the great quantitative studies on you know, learner success, and then we can look at qualitative studies that ask a slightly different question, and then we can get a picture of what's been done. So I'm just trying to get my bearing. And so I kept pushing my team to think about this because I needed a reason to sort of go forward as well. I'm really comfortable with quantitative research methods. I'm really comfortable with quantitative analyses. I was starting to learn some qual stuff. And so my brain was starting to think like, I'm gonna abandon that and now jump into something even bigger. So here's my metaphor for how I came to some clarity in my head. Which is, here's the zooming in of that complexity image that Renata showed. And so let's just say that these tangled cables represent all of assessment in health professions, all of our concerns. And so as a researcher, you could zoom in on this particular section and you'd just be overwhelmed with how complex everything is, how intermingled. And that could be your entire research career, is just teasing that part apart, but obviously you've left everything else, right? Out of necessity, but you don't necessarily integrate findings that some of your colleagues are doing or creating rather somewhere over there. And so if you zoom in on that part of it, you think, okay, there's a lot going on, but they are separate, right? So I don't have to start with the work of teasing things apart. I can pick up some of these cables and work on them. And maybe that's a 3 to 5 year kind of focus. Maybe that's a large grant application. Or, you know, in a single project, you focus in on just one element and you're done. So this could be the one project, you know, on learner success, and then you move on to something else that's of interest to you. And I think this ability to actually do all of that as the same person, right? So these little circles, I guess, are my idea of different researchers, different labs, different institutions, and maybe different philosophies about the thing they're looking at. But if this was the same person or the same team, then you come to some agreement about the issue, the situation, problem, the complexity in it, and then you move forward you create a larger plan, and then you still end up doing all these various studies. You tease apart the cables, which is like the image on the right there, and then you put them back together towards an integrated understanding of the issue. And there's just, for me, there's like, okay, I get it now. And as a team, we then embarked on what I call the Why MMR paper. We've been putting together a narrative, some of which we will share with you today in this talk, as to why mixed methods research is so important, especially for health professions education, and within the context of postgrad assessment. So going back to my naive self, thinking, well, there's quant data, it does tend to live on its own. There's qual data, it does tend to live on its own. If you put it together, as I was imagining the insights in my head, I can get some insight about the complexity of PGME. You could also think that because they are on their own, it somewhat adds to the complexity of PGME because you're only ever looking at one point to the other. And then when you hear other conversations about the same topic, you're just confused. And so I think I'll leave it at this point as to the strengths that a mixed methods plan and integrating some of your curiosities, some of the background knowledge, some of your data sources from the start can get you, which is to identify all of those interrelated research questions and then embark on multiple methods to answer them, and at some point put them back together as a mixed methods project.
So in putting this talk together and thinking through the pragmatics of how to do a thing that is not intuitive, not what we're trained to do necessarily, and is really a complex thing to do. Like a lot of these threads have different assumptions about what makes a good question. Some people might be asking, does assessment harm learners or faculty? Is it worth the time we put into it? Do people learn from it? Is it good at gatekeeping and preventing people who are not safe to practice from coming out? All of those things are really different assumptions about what's important. And even when you hear those questions, you see really different methods coming out of them. Some people are qualitatively exploring the experience of assessment and its impact. Some people are quantitatively trying to figure out if their assessment instrument is consistent across different learners or across different writers. And these conversations just happen quite separately. So how do you actually put them together? So we draw on a few resources here. There's two mixed methods sources. One is the Elizabeth Creamer, who's a qualitatively oriented mixed methods person. And the other one is Cheryl Poth, who you'll see and hear from all day today. And from there, we're bringing in this idea of a mixed methods way of thinking. How do you think about problems and sit with their complexity instead of trying to untangle the cables too soon? The other things we're drawing on is a bit of a background of mine in knowledge synthesis, specifically knowledge synthesis types that are meant to map conversations. So who's talking to whom, in what ways, about what, who's not talking to whom, and what kinds of things are they doing in their different conversations. So we're drawing on that as well. Some work from a couple of years ago on the critical review, which is a tool for doing that. And then this very recently submitted paper on a mixed critical bibliometric review. And we'll talk a bit about integration of bibliometrics into this practice of integrative thinking as well. So I wanted to say that integrative thinking is not necessary for every problem. Hot take. Sometimes you see a problem that builds on previous research and uses the tools you're used to. For some things, a hammer is just fine for what you want to do. It's the tool you need. And it feels comfortable, and we should all have those moments. And as an example, when Cheryl first came here, I'm doing some work on anti-fat bias among medical learners. And I really wanted to do a mixed method study. I really wanted to play with some of these concepts. And I tried to conceptualize it with a global expert so many times, and it was just clear that there was not enough information out there yet to conceptualize the problem in a way that would be addressed interestingly with mixed methods. And there wasn't enough quantitative data existing to make an interesting study. So I went back, and now I'm doing a very exploratory qualitative study to try to figure out what that experience is. I'm so glad I did that. I'm a bit bummed that I wasn't able to do this whole elaborate thing I had planned, but it was just the right tool for the job. But in other cases, you get to these points where something's just getting away. The solutions are not making sense. The conversation about learner experience of assessment is not talking to the experience of the gatekeeping conversation or the instrument development conversation. There's just so many different things happening that makes it hard for people to do assessment. Like, how do I make sense of all this together and do good assessment practice that doesn't harm learners, that does the things we want to do in terms of patient safety? How do we put the things together? So these are the moments where integrative thinking is helpful. You might need like a little multi-tool, you might need a hammer. Other times you're going to rummage around in the whole toolbox. You're going to find out what that thing on the left is. And you might even be wandering down the hardware aisle looking for tools you didn't even know existed. Those are the times where it's hard work to do. And some of the tools we're drawing on to pull this talk together are knowledge synthesis tools. So they're more like reviews that people would publish. They have different expectations for rigor. And I think most of you are probably not doing that. But so the idea is that you might be able to take tools from here, maybe combine them, maybe take some new tools and apply them to the work that you want to do, which might be framing a problem as opposed to publishing a full-scale literature review. So just to bring it back to Tim's talk, we wanted to situate you at where this conversation is taking place. So a research topic at the top is assessment in postgraduate education. Assessment in clinical settings, that's a topic. It doesn't say anything about what the problem is or why we should care about it. That's where you get to the research problems piece. So what's the problem? Is it that we're graduating learners who are not safe to practice? Is the problem that learners are harmed by assessment? These are all different ways of thinking about issues. And then your research purpose would be that hook. What are you going to do about that problem? What is this research going to contribute to address the problem? And all of those problems have different contributions. And then the research question, which we won't get to today, is narrowing that down to create an idea that will fit a mixed methods way of thinking, if that's where you end up, if you don't need to go back to the hammer like I did. So each line of thinking related to assessment offers a different perspective of the problem. It's nice to know if your dog fell out the window or not, but looking only at that mirror means that you're not looking in the rearview mirror. You're not seeing the car crash that happened in front of you. You're not seeing the ice on the road. So how do you create that 360 view when they're driving the car? And what are the methodologies and approaches that you need to get there? So thinking about these problems integratively might involve asking, what are all the different perspectives that might be relevant? And how do I find out about the ones that I have never heard of? The terms and keywords that aren't part of my vocabulary. What's the process for doing that? And how can we make it intentional? What are the gaps within and between perspectives? And I think knowledge syntheses tend to do that really well. Where are the gaps? How can I fit myself into that little tiny crack in between two things? I think what we want to do today is build on that and say, not only where are the gaps, but how can things meaningfully come together to coalesce and create a new way of viewing a problem. So not just a gap between, but a new way of thinking about a problem. This is a diagram I developed for that critical reviews paper that's in Journal of Graduate Medical Education. It's on the previous slide. We're drawing on this because it offers a bit of a cycle, and I think that sense of iteration is so critical to problem development when you're trying to do integrative thinking. So you're starting with this idea of focusing and discussing things with experts, refining that problem. You need to talk to other people to find out the things you don't know, the terms you might not know to use. You're doing some searching and maybe some bibliometric or Latin mapping. Again, more about the bibliometrics later if you don't know that term. You're appraising to decide if things are relevant. Is this actually going to move me forward, or is this a perspective that needs to stay off to the left? Is it outdated? Is it something I don't need? So you're kind of picking things up, picking up that tool and saying, is this tool going to help me build my project? You're selecting articles that are most helpful or perspectives that are most helpful. And then you're doing analyses to try to figure out how they fit together for your work. And the diagram is a thing that's an evolution, but there's a bit of a cycle, but also not a linear cycle. Like the diagram suggests that they're happening in order, but in reality, you're probably moving through between these things pretty regularly. If you get new search terms, you do a new search, and then you might go back and focus again and realize you need to talk to someone different. So that's what this idea is meant to represent. You're kind of braiding different approaches together. And I think in my postdoc, this is something I had to do all at once, right? All at once, I had to figure out in just 2 short years how to reconceptualize a problem and figure out what my space was. But now that I have a long-term job and no end necessarily to the funding for my position, I can do it a bit more luxuriously. And I think that integrative thinking can seem really challenging, and it's kind of a bummer in a postdoc when there's so much pressure to come up with your idea quickly. But in a faculty position or other types of positions, you can kind of luxuriously roll out your idea, right? So you might start by just talking to people. Has everyone heard of the elevator pitch in their PhDs, postdocs, everywhere else? You have this quick elevator pitch and you take these little opportunities to pitch your idea. You want to look for what people are interested in, what makes them light up, what makes them glaze over, and think about who, like what perspective is this capturing, what interest is this capturing, and who is it leaving out? And you want to see what kind of questions they ask. Like, what do they care about within this question? Because it will tell you a little bit about what the different parts of it are. And you might find that that little yellow light bulb is not actually part of what interests you. So you might know about it, put it back in the box, but you might also pick up some of those other light bulbs, some of those other ideas, some of those other ways of thinking. And you want to be intentional about capturing different kinds of perspectives as well. Like we talk to other researchers pretty regularly. We talk a lot to people who use the same methodologies or talk about the same topics as we do, but we don't necessarily like talking to people who might say things that we disagree with or whose language we don't understand. I mean, more in terms of terminology. But that's the space to push yourself outside of your comfort zone, to learn those new terms, to explore them, and to find out if they fit for you. Additionally, Cheryl's book in particular talks a little bit about talking to knowledge users, policymakers, thinking through those committees you might sit on, or or in my context anyway, educational conversations you might have where you can pitch this idea to see how it resonates or doesn't for the people who might be using that. Where are the conversations in the gray literature? What's happening on social media? What's happening in conferences? Because I think we get kind of stuck if we only look at the academic literature, which tends to have those same conversations over and over again, and also is by definition 5 years out of date, at least. It's the stuff that we got funding for a long time ago. So integrative thinking involves taking the light bulbs, but also figuring out how they fit together, how that new project will look if things talk to each other instead of sit beside each other.
All right, I'm going to go back to my example that I introduced before. And I personally love this diagram. I use it a lot. I've included it in a few manuscripts. I use it to teach as well. And for those of you who could visualize, the real diagram actually has layers where these things spin around. So you could be at the focus stage while sampling and like appraising. And I think if you can draw this diagram for yourself as to where you want to be with the project, that can also help keep you on track. If you're confused about why you're wherever you are, you could draw this diagram and decide how much of each step or each phase rather you've spent time on. But if I take you to the PGME assessment topic and why would we need mixed methods research, I propose that within the context of assessment research, specifically in medical education, in that context, I propose that innovation around the methods that we use to assess, around the kinds of data that we use to make decisions about clinical competence, has stalled. And I say that because, I'm not in every school, so I'm not saying that innovation doesn't happen locally. But when I think of the last famous thing to hit the road, hit something, I don't know, to appear, sorry, was like the OSCE or the MMI, or those sort of structured things that are now part of every admissions process for medical schools and part of all residency programs. And I am being specific to medical education, but also because for several reasons, but just to explain, I'm not trying to exclude the others, but those assessment conversations are going to be different. The medicine contexts tend to get a lot more publications. They tend to get cited more. There's a lot more productivity conducted by in sort of medicine, family medicine, surgery, those fields. But even then, the North American story gets told a lot, and then that doesn't generalize to even South America or like anywhere else on the planet. I don't think that we spend enough time talking about that. So in trying to make sense of this, why do we need mixed methods research? And, in parallel, this idea that I think we've just stalled. Everything's really stale when it comes to assessment literature. And how do we put that together? It had to be within one context of assessing residents, medical residents, postgrads, and taking the wide question to see what benefit does it bring us in this context. Going back, maybe I'll just go back to this. In terms of our process, I mentioned that we'd invited Cheryl to come and teach us, and so we're the light bulbs. We being the merit faculty who agreed to go on this journey to invest in learning about mixed methods research. So in that room, as soon as I said why, we became the light bulbs and all the ideas came forward, and I completely took over Cheryl's presentation, whatever she had planned. Getting people to talk about that, did they agree? There were a lot of other people who were experts in medical education assessment, people who contributed specifically to competence by design and other kind of concepts like that. And it validated my belief that, yes, innovation seems to have stalled, at least at that national level. And maybe in part because a lot of faculty and residents were also disgruntled about having to go through CBD. And so no one really wanted to try to think about new ideas. But in that room, all these ideas popped up that said, yes, I think there might be something there where mixed methods research might be a way to bring the country back together again, to start reinvigorate this conversation about where should we take postgrad assessment. And so that's us at the center, those light bulbs, the research team, throwing around ideas. There's all of it was happening at once, because when you have some of the nation's experts on postgrad assessment in the room, and yes, you also have an outsider. Renate was probably the only one that said, I'm falling asleep. You're talking about postgrad assessment. I don't know what any of that is. But she brought in that insight and some of the methodological challenges of what we were raising. But the sampling of articles was kind of happening as we were talking about stuff we've written, we've reviewed, we've read, appraising the relevance of all of that to my assumption that innovation has stalled. We were developing a focus. Broadly, why do we need mixed methods research? But what we were also doing was learning that we needed a worked example, because we couldn't just say why mixed methods research for all of health professions education, because that's just, how do you do that? Lit review. So focusing in on the postgrad context helped the people in that room have that conversation. And then in terms of analyzing and searching, I'll get into that a little bit. Renate mentioned the use of a bibliometric mapping tool to, let's say, supplement your literature search and supplement some of the assumptions that might be brought by the research team into shaping your focus. and then qualitatively oriented, that project was qualitatively oriented in that we were using a qualitative perspective or analysis of our own knowledge, our own lived experiences, our own scholarship, what we saw out there, what we knew was being said in different competence committee meetings. And sorry, I don't have a transition for that, but I'll focus in on the bibliometric mapping. Did you want to? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yes, I was taking over. I'll step aside for a second. I'll come back to the story.
I was just thinking while Sandra was talking that one of the most interesting conversations I thought we had when we were doing that expert consult exercise was there's this one space in assessment where the lead researcher is really interested in collective assessment. So people don't work independently, they work interdependently. So you're only as competent as your team, but then we assess people individually. Huge problem, we all know it is, we don't know what to do about it. So she's been trying to figure out how to take this qualitatively driven work on collective competence and translate it into assessing people collectively. But when we talked to one of the researchers on that team, she said, yeah, we do. She's a psychometrician, I think. She's quantitatively trained anyway. And her postdoc supervisor is a hardcore qualitatively trained person. And she said, we do both kinds of work, but we publish it separately. And like, that was interesting that even this opportunity where things are trying to merge, it just divides again into two separate publications, two different journals, two different arguments for what the problem is. And that just seemed to reinforce the idea that this is needed. That expert consult was so telling for me. It was just such an interesting moment, such a moment of opportunity, but also maybe a bit disappointment. Anyway, so the next piece of the cycle I wanted to address is this idea of how to do that lit review. And I think the most important piece is that iterative nature, right? You're kind of learning new terms, you're going and checking them out, you might discard them, you might keep them. But alongside of that, I wanted to introduce this idea of bibliometric mapping and how that might fit into the work of mapping a problem. Does anyone know the word bibliometrics? Like a little nodding? Okay, I'm not going to ask if anyone uses it. I will make you define it because I'm going to tell you what it is. Bibliometric mapping is the use of metadata attached to publications to map their impact and their relationships to each other. So there's two basic kinds of bibliometric mapping. One is like an impact type assessment. There's a word for it, can't remember right now, but it's looking at like how much, how many times is this cited? How many times do people cite things over time? Like how did the citation patterns change? So you're kind of looking at amounts. Are things being cited? By whom? Where? How are they being taken up? The other type of bibliometrics is relational bibliometrics, which looks a bit more at who's working with who's talking to who's citing who. And I think when you think about that, it immediately seems like a relevant tool for this kind of work. Like who is talking to who? How can we zoom out and figure out what that conversation is in a different way? Because I think sometimes as a qualitative researcher, you get in there and you can get a little bit lost in the qualitative data. So you think, oh, you know, this seems to have really changed over time, but has it? I don't know. It seems kind of like very tiny little changes. Or you think, it seems like these people are talking to these people, but not these people. So bibliometrics offers a nice way to zoom out and show those relationships between pieces, to offer a space for reflection. So this would be in MMR terms, like a little quantitative piece. So it's a tiny little like perspective check that can then support the qualitative work of figuring out and mapping this literature. So in that sense, it would then give you a perspective and you might find, oh yeah, that really confirms that this conversation is not happening. Or you might find, oh, like what's that little piece of the pie where people are citing the same thing? What is that thing and how are they citing it? And then you're going to dive into the qualitative piece to explore, confirm, extend, figure out what that contradiction is or what that different perspective is. I just nerded out a little bit. So I'll give you an example of it now that Sandra's gonna.
All right, so I said we'd get back to, well, I'll just show this for a second. We'll get back to that search and analyze part of this circle. And yeah, so this is initial data. And don't try to make sense of it too much right now. I will explain what it is, but this is one product you can get from a bibliometric analysis. Going back to this circle, the iterative searching. So everyone here is probably familiar with just a standard lit review, and you've got keywords and you go off and you find things that are relevant to your topic, and you might constrain it to like certain publication dates. But a bibliometric analysis, particularly with the help of a skilled librarian or someone knowledgeable of library science tools or software, there's a lot more software that can automate some of these processes. So at some point, this would have been people like opening up volumes and counting words for you. But there's metadata in all of the electronic versions of articles online that can be searched with these software. And you can ask, which we did. We found an excellent health science librarian. His name is Jack. And we asked Jack to help us quantify basically my assumption. The heart of my assumption around innovation being stalled in post-grad assessment is that, going back to that slide where the quant and the qual sort of just happened separately. And that plus sign in the middle was sort of imaginary, really, or it was the researcher's responsibility, the next person asking a question, to integrate that if they so chose. But I imagine that the lack of innovation is partly due to any ideas coming from quantitative measures would live over here, insights from qualitative interviews or other kinds of methods for generating data would live over here, and rarely do they integrate. Even if some of the authors are doing both work, they may not think to tell the story together. And going to the story that Renate was referring to, the colleague that said, yeah, we do plan an integrated design from the beginning. We do the mixed methods study. But within health professions education, or just health professions generally, there's very strict word counts. And so when you go to publish a very complex, beautiful design, you end up having to tell the different stories separately. So you might publish your entire protocol first, you might then tell the story about the interviews, or you might tell the team discussion story. In our project, the light bulbs that were in that room, we expanded on them. So we nominated some experts in Canada that we thought could contribute to that story. So we added light bulbs to synthesis to confirm what my assumptions were. We also went to the literature to quantify who was citing who. And the way that we were able to do it was to go to the names of people we nominated, and we specifically had tagged these individuals as known for quantitative research methodologies or known for qualitative research methodologies. And so I'll focus your attention on the larger red circle at the top that says Lingard, and then also the larger green circle closer to this corner that says Norman. So the green stuff, the nodes in the green stuff, were people on a list that I gave Jack. And I said, these people, you know what? 80 to 90% of their work that's published is quantitative in nature. And then the people in red, I said, 80, 90% of the work they've done where they've been PI or senior author is qualitative in nature. And for those of you who know Teresa Chan, I said, you know what, just make Teresa Chan a topic on her own, because I don't know what to do with her and she's gonna mess everything up. So she's over there, she's separate from the nodes of everything else. And my goal was to understand, does quant, green, cite qual, red? Does qual, red, cite green? And you can see the volume of qual, but the point is that the green lines traveling between green nodes is more common than the green lines going across to the red. So I was thrilled to hear that, because that was the entire assumption of a project and a manuscript that we were building. But hopefully you can appreciate the different ways in which you can generate data from different sources to validate the same assumption. Really, it was the team within, the consultants outside, and then also with library science, some quantitative validation around that. And that's kind of 3 different tools to integrate our thinking about this and confirm our thinking about it. eh,
I say my list.
yes, yeah, sorry.
They ended up a little bit out of order because the last thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of visualization. And bibliometrics is just one way to visualize that I'm particularly nerded out about right now, so I couldn't help but share it with you. I think it does some really cool things, like the size of the nodes is related to, I think, absolute number of publications, or is it absolute number of citations? Doesn't matter.
Sorry.
Like they're kind of the biggest things in the field, right? They're the things that are getting the most press, or the people that are getting the most press. So it's like interesting that the biggest ones are the furthest apart. So they have the least in common in terms of citation patterns. So that stuff is really fun. But there's lots of other ways to do visualization that are important. Like Tim talked about some of them. There's different approaches to concept mapping. There's Post-it notes on the wall. But I think for me, that visualization is such a key tool to figuring out how things go together. So how do we go beyond having things side by side or in separate corners of the boxing ring or whatever, and put them in relationship to each other? And for me, that usually involves a Zoom whiteboard, having my little circles and figuring out how they fit together to produce different kinds of questions or different kinds of ways of thinking about ideas. Sometimes as Post-it notes can be a lot of different things. So we'll invite you to think about not just how you can map a literature, but how you can reconceptualize it to put things back together again. And that
brings this. Okay, this is my wrap up for that, taking you back to this, separating out the lines of research, putting them back together through one box and integrating everything to come out at the end. It's possible that some of you are also sitting there going, well, everything you've said, Sandra, I already do. Like, obviously I talk to the experts in the field. Obviously I'll go do a lit search and I'll count things up. I would argue we owe it to our readers to make those steps explicit. And I think that's what mixed methods at the end brings to us, an advantage, a benefit, a strength, is that it gives us the tools to map that out from the start and make explicit to newer people joining the field that this is the thinking that goes into it. And then these are the threads that got dropped off along the way. This is the stuff that led to really productive research, and being able to even just tell that story for ourselves as a team and then to our learners is the best thing about mixed methods research. I think we're gonna, hopefully that's an inspirational thought to leave you with as we move into the breakout sessions and giving you an opportunity to discuss some of these ideas or challenge them. We'd like to hear your complaints, outbursts as well. There's that. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to do anything, but I'm assuming that that's a slide we can leave up there for you to consider while you discuss at your tables. You could also have some other questions, of course, and then we'll bring you back together as we did before.